Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for our webinar, in which we focus on the dual approach to assessment in Year 3 of Junior Cycle Visual Art. My name is Gemma Tierney, and I am joined here by my fellow JCT Visual Art colleague, Ruth Kennington, who will co-present with me this evening. My fellow colleagues and team leader will be answering queries throughout the evening. The purpose of this evening's webinar is to support you and your students in continuing to develop your understanding of Year 3 in visual art. Before we begin the broadcast, we'll give you some information to ensure you get the most out of this evening's webinar. Your control panel is going to minimise to this tab on the right, which is called the Grab tab. At any point, you can click on the orange arrow icon to expand or minimise the panel. If you prefer to have it visible for the entire seminar, you just right-click on the icon and unclick the Auto Hide option. We have also made some materials available to you within the panel. We will be referring to these materials throughout the session. Here is our website that will support you throughout the 3 years of Junior Cycle. On our website, you will find all of our available supports, such as workshop PowerPoints, suggested planning templates, sample planning videos, webinars, screencasts, and artist videos, as well as news and information. The key documents are located on the key documents page. A recording of this webinar will be available in the coming days in the CPD support section of our website, as well as the previous recordings of our 3 webinars. These are our key documents: the framework for Junior Cycle, our visual art specification, our assessment guidelines, the January 2019 edition, and circular letter S10618. You will find all of the information and more in the assessment guidelines and circular S10618, and we would advise that you are familiar with both of these documents. To model good practice, our learning intention for tonight's webinar is to develop our understanding of assessment in Year 3 of Junior Cycle Visual Art. Please take a moment to read this slide. It is important to note there are 2 forms of assessment which complement each other in 3rd year of Junior Cycle Visual Art. Both Classroom-Based Assessment 2 and the final assessment will be reported to students, parents and guardians in the Junior Cycle Profile of Achievement. You will be familiar with this timeline from our CPD days, and it gives an overview of the 3 years of Junior Cycle Visual Art. There are 2 classroom-based assessments in visual art. They are assessed at common level. They relate to specified learning outcomes and are scheduled to be undertaken by students within class contact time to a national timetable as stipulated by the NCCA. Once the SLAR process for CBA2 has taken place and students have received feedback, the final assessment can begin. Let's look at Year 3 in more detail. Year 3 of Junior Cycle will be completed in 2 phases. The first phase is Classroom-Based Assessment 2. The second phase is the final assessment. At the beginning of 3rd year, students will be issued with a brief. The brief will serve both Phase 1 and Phase 2 and will be issued by the State Examinations Commission on Monday, the 9th of September 2019. It will be published on the State Examinations Commission website. The window for the first phase, CBA2, called Communicate and Reflect, is between September the 9th and November the 29th, 2019. Teachers have the professional autonomy to choose the start date, finish date and duration of CBA2 during this window. Students will work individually for both phases. During CBA2, students will research, explore and present their work based on the themes in this brief. The work for this phase will be documented in their visual art sketchpad. At the end of Phase 1, teachers will use the features of quality for CBA2 to award a provisional descriptor, select samples of work and attend their SLAR meeting, review their assessment of student work, share the descriptor with their students, and give students feedback that focuses them on going forward with their work. The work for this phase is not assessed by the State Examinations Commission. Phase 2. As phase 1 draws to a close, the State Examinations Commission will issue schools with a workbook to help students complete the second phase of their project. In this workbook, students will decide on one theme, develop their ideas further, and make 2 artefacts. A communicate and reflect form makes up the first 2 pages. The next 2 pages of the booklet are called the Influences Sheet. The purpose of this section is to allow students to make references to visual culture and appreciation. Following the Influences Sheet, there will be 2 development sheets, Development Sheet 1 and 2, which will allow students to develop their ideas further. Students will realise 2 artefacts, which must be based on the visual and written information in the workbook. At the end of the process, students will complete a reflection and evaluation, which is on the last page of the workbook. We will discuss each of these areas in more detail throughout the presentation. But first, we'll go to the rationale of classroom-based assessment 2. Let's take a moment to remind ourselves about the classroom-based assessments. Classroom-based assessments are best described as occasions when the teacher assesses students' work using specific tasks set out in the subject specification. The specific task in CBA 2 facilitates students to engage with themes and create a body of research and exploratory work. Building on the previous slide, please take a moment to read this quote. Feedback is a crucial step in classroom-based assessments. Providing feedback will support our students to reflect on their learning and take the next steps. I will give you a moment to read this extract from our specification. During our workshops, we regularly discuss the importance of the safe space we provide for our students to experiment, to fail, and to learn. While we do not want our children to face ongoing failure, to attempt to overprotect them and rush in whenever we fear they might fail robs them of an important lesson, namely that mistakes are experiences from which to learn. It is important to remember the ways in which children understand and respond to mistakes and setbacks are a key component of a resilient child. Children and young people learn more effectively, and they have better academic outcomes if they are happy in their work, believe in themselves, and feel acknowledged and supported in their schools. National and international research highlights the well-being of our children and young people is critical to their success in education and in life. Well-being is present when a person realises their potential. They are resilient in dealing with the normal stresses of their life, take care of their physical well-being, and have a sense of purpose, connection, and belonging to a wider community. It needs nurturing throughout life. With this in mind, we can reflect on the visual art specification, which states that CBA 2 provides our students with a space in which it is safe to experiment, to fail, and to learn. We might consider what that could look like in CBA 2 and why it is important to build a young person's resilience. Self-esteem is caused by a whole range of successes and failures within the world. Children and adults feel better when they feel competent, when they are able to master a subject, and in regards to our mistakes, when they are allowed to make errors and learn that they can recover. That is why the concept of resiliency, which is how well a child can recover from the inevitable ups and downs, has become a goal in creating happy and successful children and adults. The truth is, children, and actually all of us, need to succeed at some things, but not at everything. And that is why, while they shouldn't fail all the time, they must fail sometimes. So what are the benefits of CBA2? It allows students the time to research, to experiment, to develop the ideas, skills and techniques in a space and time that's not pressurised, and it allows students to learn from the mistakes that they might make. It also allows teachers the time and space to facilitate learning in a variety of disciplines, should they wish to, without the pressure of realising finished pieces. So after considering the rationale and benefits of CBA2, we will now look at phase 1 in more detail. There are 3 key areas of CBA2 as outlined in the assessment guidelines. We will begin by considering research and exploration. So what does it mean to research and explore in the visual art classroom? We will now pause to give you some time to share how your students research and explore in your art classroom. And you may contribute by typing your response into the questions tab on the side of your screen. Okay, we are getting in some responses now. These are great. A few of the suggestions that are coming in. I facilitate my students to brainstorm alone, but also in groups. Somebody else suggested they like to use word association games and visual verbal squares. Some students use dictionaries or thesaurus to explore alternate meanings and expand on their ideas. So if you please could keep your suggestions coming in, Ruth will actually refer to them very shortly. For more information on research and exploration in the art room, please see our webinar which we broadcast earlier this year, which was called A Focus on Research and Exploration in the Visual Art Classroom. Now we'll consider the area of present. Students will have created a body of work containing their research and exploration for classroom-based assessment 2. The students will communicate their approaches, thoughts and techniques to their peers and teacher. The work the students present should be sufficient enough to communicate the general direction the work may take for the state certified final assessment. The purpose of this is to allow students to pause and reflect and also to gather feedback. So how might our students present their work in the visual art classroom? Could they present their work in pairs, in small groups, to the whole class, to a different class, or perhaps to invited guests? Maybe it's in the form of crits. It could be a digital presentation or an e-portfolio, or maybe it's an exhibition. Could your students present their work in different formats in the same class? Will your students present all, some, or a selection of their work for feedback? And how will they choose? And what methodologies could they use to gather feedback? Would the feedback be oral, written, digital, or a combination of formats? So we're just going to pause the presentation now for a few moments to go over to Ruth to answer some of the most frequently asked questions.
Thanks very much, Gemma. So we are sorting through your questions here, but before we do get to those, we might share some of your responses to the earlier question, where you shared with us how your students research and explore in your visual art classroom. So one example that you've sent us in here is, my students prefer to explore their ideas through using mind maps, often illustrating the mind map rather than using text. Another example is to select and draw a wide range of primary sources related to their chosen theme. So that's been coming in quite a few times. And another example, My students explore their themes through the lens of visual culture. We like to discuss examples of artists and designer makers from different cultures, investigating their methods, materials and approaches. And so we'd like to thank you for submitting some of your ideas there and your classroom experiences. So we might at this point just take one quick question, and we'll refer to some of your later questions in later sections. So the question we look at here is, how do students present their work for CBA2? And do all students need to present their work in the same way? For example, do they all need to stand up and do an oral presentation? Okay, so I suppose it's important to point out that the fundamental purpose for students in presenting their CBA2 sketchbook is for them to gather feedback. So the student might choose to do this in any one or in a range of ways. For example, displaying in the form of a wall display or a class crit perhaps. And this would allow students to share their initial research and exploratory work, discussing it with students and you, the teacher, of course, and the possible directions it might take. It may suit your students to do a formal presentation, such as an oral presentation, but this is not a requirement in classroom-based assessment 2. So with those, we'll pass you over to Gemma for the next section.
That's great. Thanks a million, Ruth. Now we will take you through the steps to consider before the classroom-based assessment. So again, a quick reminder, all of the key information for this webinar has been taken from the Junior Cycle Visual Art Assessment Guidelines, the January 2019 edition, Circular Letter S10618, and a sample brief, which are also available through links on our website. It is important to be familiar with these because they also detail the student experience and journey through CBA2. Please note the brief on your screen is only a sample brief, as the first brief will be issued to schools on Monday the 9th of September. The project brief, which governs both Phase 1 and Phase 2, incorporates the instructions to candidates and will be issued on Monday the 9th of September 2019, and it will also appear on the State Examinations Commission website. It might be useful for your art department to look at and review the examples of student work, which will be available on www.curriculumonline.ie, and you might consider discussing these as an art department. You will require your Teaching Council number to access the examples that are available online. Please note, the section on Curriculum Online will be populated with further examples in due course. There are key learning outcomes that support CBA2, and these are related to the features of quality, which we as teachers will use to assess our student work. These are not new learning outcomes, and they have been taken from the 45 visual art learning outcomes that are set out in our specification. Remember, we will always design learning experiences or projects beginning with learning outcomes, and this provides us with a variety of opportunities and possibilities that best suit our students' needs and context. When we are planning for classroom-based assessment 2, we might consider integrating learning outcomes from across the elements and strands to create rich learning experiences or projects. That is to say, we can plan using learning outcomes for CBAs from across the strands and elements. Here is an example of an approach you might take, selecting learning outcomes from across the 3 strands. And here's another example of an approach you might take, selecting learning outcomes from 2 strands. You can select the learning outcomes to suit your own students' needs and context. I will say, however, it is essential that you include all 5 elements of visual art, as these not only align with aspects of the features of quality, but also support the students' engagement with the artistic process. In CBA2, Communicate and Reflect, students will prepare towards realising 2 artefacts in 2 strands for the SEC final assessment. There are 3 strands in visual art: art, craft and design. Students over the course of junior cycle must realise a work through each strand. Students will have already completed a classroom-based assessment 1 in one of these strands. The artefacts that students develop and make for the final assessment must be made through the other two strands. There are no discipline lists for CBA2 or for the state-certified final assessment. You have the autonomy to interpret the learning outcomes to develop a classroom-based assessment to suit your students' needs and context. It's also important to note, students must realise a minimum of one artefact in 3 dimensions in either CBA1 in Year 2 or for the state certified examination in Year 3. However, students can realise more than one 3-dimensional piece across the 2 years. It is also important to consider when you might aim to participate in a SLAR meeting. Some feedback we got last year from teachers highlighted the importance of setting a date and time for your SLAR at the beginning of CBA2. You will find further information on organising and engaging in the subject learning and assessment review meeting on jct.ie. It is important when we as teachers are designing a unit of learning for the CBA that we consider the age and stage of our students. Remember, CBA2 is about capturing a short period of student learning. CBA2 is not a rehearsal for the final assessment for the State Examinations Commission. When deciding the amount of time a CBA2 might take, it is important to factor in matches, illnesses, and other school-related activities that will occur. Build flexibility into your planning. Classroom-based assessments in visual art are a part of teaching and learning. Therefore, throughout the CBA, we would plan and teach as we normally do, assign homework where appropriate, and give feedback we normally would within our school contexts. There is also a recognition that no single assessment event can provide evidence of the full range of student achievement. All assessment in junior cycle, whether it's formative or summative, moment in time or ongoing assessment, designed by the SEC, the NCCA, or teacher designed, they should all have at their primary purpose the support of student learning. We also need to consider opportunities to promote student voice in a meaningful way, such as encouraging students to choose their own theme, explore media in a variety of ways, and demonstrate a personal approach to their work. As with CBA1, it is important to become familiar with the descriptors. There are 4 level descriptors of achievement in each classroom-based assessment. They are yet to meet expectations, in line with expectations, above expectations, and exceptional. These are universal across all subjects, and your students may be quite familiar with them already. It is also important that teachers are familiar with the features of quality for classroom-based assessment 2. These are different to classroom-based assessment 1, as there are different learning outcomes being assessed. Students should also be familiar with them. You might choose to break them down so that your students understand them. Let's have a look at the features of quality that are aligned with the descriptor in line with expectations. Please take a moment to read the features of quality for in line with expectations. Let's have a look at each one individually and how it might help us plan for our students in CBA2. The work demonstrates a fair interpretation of the chosen theme or themes through drawing and experimentation. How might our students show they have considered the theme or themes through drawing? What materials, techniques, or approaches might our students experiment with? The research presented is purposeful. What does the research look like? And what do we mean by purposeful? The work submitted demonstrates a fair understanding and use of the elements of visual art. Do our students understand and use the elements of visual art, visual culture and appreciation, drawing, critical and visual language, the art elements and design principles, and media throughout their work? Reflection is fair and demonstrates a fair understanding of how the work will be further developed. In the final feature, we look at reflection and how it impacts on students' research and exploration. We could ask, how have our students demonstrated that they have reflected throughout their work? And have they showed how their work will be developed further? Developing this feature will support our students in how they will develop their own work going forward. Now we will take you through some of the steps to consider during the classroom-based assessment. As we know, our specification defines primary sources as sources that are physical or conceptual, that are viewed in their original state and are not filtered through another person's interpretation of them. So with this in mind, we could consider some of the following things. What primary sources might our students gather and collect related to their theme? How important is it that they have a personal connection to what they collect? And how long will their chosen primary sources sustain them throughout the process? As part of classroom-based assessment 2, students will interpret the theme or themes. They will indicate the 2 visual art strands through which they will primarily generate their realised works. Research and explore their initial ideas. They will engage with the elements of visual art, record all their work and annotations in their visual art sketchpad. They will curate and present their initial ideas to their teacher and peers, and they will record and reflect on feedback received by their teacher and peers. A point to note, students must work individually for CBA2, but this isn't to say they can't take part in aspects of formative assessment such as group evaluations or crits, maybe peer assessment or class discussions. Regarding the visual art sketchpad, students will continue to document their processes in their visual sketchpads. These can again be physical or digital format. They can be any size or scale. This is decided by our teacher and students. The sketchpads are used to capture ideas, creativity, experiments, explorations, visual culture, and to solve problems. The sketchpad for CBA2 can be the same sketchpad they use for everyday classwork, and homework can be documented here also. Please remember that CBA should reflect as much as possible normal classroom practice. There are some examples on your screen of different sketchbook formats. These were actually made by our teachers during elective arts and junior cycle summer school this summer. We're going to take a pause in our presentation again to answer some of the most frequently asked questions that have been coming in. So back over to Ruth.
Thanks, Gemma. So we'd like to thank you for sending in all of your questions to date and to keep those questions coming into us. Okay, so we're going to begin with, should students practice for the final assessment during the CBA2 time? Okay, so classroom-based assessment 2 is a time for students to explore a range of possibilities, to research a variety of artists that might influence or inform their work. It's a valuable time to consider one or all of the themes before narrowing it down for one for the SEC final assessment. It's a time to research and experiment in new areas of practice or disciplines, and to try out various materials and processes to see which might interest them. But more importantly, it's a space and time to test and challenge ideas and to ultimately take ownership to develop valuable key skills going forward. One final note, as the focus is on research, exploration and reflection, the student will not realise artefacts during CBA2 time. We also have, how can I support students to conduct independent research and exploration, as a question. So this is central to our students' experience of CBA2, which in turn lays down a really firm foundation for their experience of the final assessment in phase 2. So where do we start in regards to this? We really do need to think about what we want our students to learn and the value of that learning, and we need to plan for those learning experiences in our classrooms. Now, I might just take this opportunity to direct you to our webinar 3, which was broadcast earlier this year, and it's entitled Research and Exploration in the Visual Arts Classroom, and you can find it in the Visual Arts section of the JCT website. And another question we have here is, this year art departments will experience 2 classroom-based assessments. Does this not put us under more time pressure? So it's really important to remind ourselves that classroom-based assessments are exactly that. They are classroom-based learning. And by that I mean that they are like every other classroom activity where the focus is on the formative learning experience rather than the summative moment or summative focus at the end. So that's all the questions we have time for just at the minute, but there will be another couple of question points coming up a little later in the presentation. So I'll hand you back to Gemma.
That's great. Thanks a million, Ruth. And thank you again for sending all your questions in. We can see there are lots of questions coming in this evening, which is great. So we're going to look at the steps that you might take after the CBA2, and this will be very familiar if you have embarked on a CBA1 last year as well. So classroom-based assessments are assessed by students' teachers, and they are reported on to students and parents and guardians during junior cycle and in the junior cycle profile of achievement. As with CBA1, teachers will follow the same format at the end of CBA2. We are going to consider each of these areas now. When students have completed CBA2, it is important to remember to leave enough time to use the features of quality to provisionally award a descriptor to their work. Again, the 4 descriptors that may be awarded are yet to meet expectations, in line with expectations, above expectations, and exceptional. When using the features of quality to assess the level of student achievement in a classroom-based assessment, teachers use an on-balance judgment. What I mean by that is teachers should read the feature of quality, starting with yet to meet expectations, until they reach a descriptor that best fits the work being assessed. In preparation for the subject learning and assessment review meeting, each teacher will then identify one sample of students' work for each descriptor, where feasible, and will have these available for discussion at the SLAR meeting. Again, as I said earlier, there is more information on SLAR meetings in jct.ie. After the SLAR process, teachers might wish to re-evaluate their judgment, and when satisfied, can award the students their descriptor and give the feedback on their learning. A point to note, SLAR meetings should take place no more than a month after the completion of the classroom-based assessment. On your screen now, you can see the key dates for classroom-based assessment 2. The dates at the beginning and the end indicate a window in which CBA2 can be completed. It is anticipated that during phase 1, not all of the class time for visual art will be devoted to working directly on the project. Students will continue to engage in learning activities that may be unrelated or only indirectly related to their projects. As we know, students learn best when teachers provide feedback that helps students to understand how their learning can be improved. You might remember this slide from our CPD days relating to feedback. You will find more information related to feedback on jct.ie. And I'm going to pause again in the presentation because we've come to the end of the section on classroom-based assessment 2. So we're just going to pop over to Ruth to wrap up some more questions.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Okay, so we have a few questions here. Wrapping up the CBA 2 section. And we're going to begin with, does the SEC look at the student work from CBA 2? Okay, so the SEC examiner will not mark the work completed for CBA 2 as this has already will have been assessed by the teacher. And another question we have here is, what percentage of the final assessment is the CBA 2 worth? Okay, so on September the 9th, a brief will be issued by the SEC, which will specify themes for the classroom-based assessment 2, communicate and reflect, and the state certified examination. So CBA 2 is assessed by us, the teachers, using the features of quality for CBA 2, and it is reported on using descriptors to students, parents and guardians through your school's reporting system and in the JCPA. And just to note here that there is no assessment task in visual art. And then the state certified examination part, or the final assessment, which comprises of the development work and the 2 realised pieces, that will comprise of 100% of the overall grade. And the development work and the 2 realised pieces will be assessed by the SEC as they currently are in school in June. And just to remind you, or to note, that there will be no invigilated drawing examinations in junior cycle visual art. And we've just time for one more question in this section. Do we use the same themes for CBA 2 and the SEC final assessment? So yes, as mentioned just there, the brief issued by the SEC in September, it will specify the themes for classroom-based assessment 2 and the state certified final assessment. So your students have the choice of exploring one or all of the themes from this SEC brief during CBA 2, but for phase 2, the final assessment, they will need to focus on one of the themes from this SEC brief. So that's all we have time for in this section, but we will have one more question point coming up, and so I'll pass you back to Gemma.
Great, thanks a million for that, Ruth. So before we look at the final assessment, let's have a short recap. So phase 1, classroom-based assessment 2. In this phase, students research, experiment and develop ideas and techniques from a range of primary sources based on the themes in the brief that will be posted to schools in early September. Students may explore one or more than one theme in this phase before choosing the theme they want to continue with. Classroom-based assessment 2 will be completed by early December. Students' work for this phase will be collected in their visual art sketchpad. At the end of this research and experimentation phase, students present their work and reflect on feedback from their teacher and peers. So now we're going to go into phase 2, or the final assessment. As phase 1 draws to a close, the State Examinations Commission will issue schools with a workbook to help students complete the second phase of their project, in which they will develop their ideas further and they will make their final artefacts. The Communicate and Reflect form makes up the first 2 pages that they will complete in this workbook. They will use the form as a starting point to further develop their ideas and techniques in order to realise the 2 artefacts. These are our 3 key documents that support the final assessment in particular. On the right is Circular S-106-18, and in the middle is a sample brief for classroom-based assessment 2 and the final assessment. The image on the left is the visual art workbook, which relates only to the final assessment. You will find all of the information needed and more in these documents. They were posted to schools last December, and we would recommend that you are familiar with all of them. We're now going to take you through the format and relevant details of the visual art workbook for the final assessment. It begins with a full page of instructions to candidates and regulations relating to the final assessment procedures. It is advisable to familiarise yourself with all of the instructions carefully. Some of the key areas for candidates have been summarised here. Your work should be mainly visual in nature. Your realised artefacts must be based on the visual and written information assembled in the workbook. All of the work that you submit must be in response to one of the themes from the Junior Cycle Visual Art Brief. Working from primary sources based on your chosen theme should be a feature of your work all the way throughout your project. Throughout the workbook, you must demonstrate observational and analytical drawing, as well as the use of drawing to develop ideas in a range of media. You must work directly into this workbook. However, you may make studies or photographs outside of the classroom and include them in your workbook, but you are not allowed to increase the workspace available by adding extra pages. Your workbook and realised works must not be removed from the school under any circumstances, as doing so will result in the project being considered invalid and no marks will be awarded. The Communicate and Reflect form makes up the next 2 pages that candidates will complete in this workbook. This is the link between Classroom-Based Assessment 2 and the final assessment. This form must be filled out by candidates and must be based on the candidate's own work. It's the first step in the second phase of the project, and it is important as the information captured in this form is a plan for how work will further progress. Candidates are required to indicate on the Communicate and Reflect form in the workbook which strands they worked through for Classroom-Based Assessment 1 and whether or not the work for that assessment was in 3 dimensions. The artefacts that they develop and make for the final assessment must be made through the other 2 strands. If they did not realise through 3 dimensions for Classroom-Based Assessment 1, they will need to realise in 3 dimensions for the final assessment. Now we will look at the influences sheet. The influences sheet will show how the candidate's study of contemporary and historical visual culture informs and relates to their work. These may be from a wide range of visual stimuli, and they can include, for example, reference to approaches, techniques, methods, ideas, or other visual messages. The influences sheet should include work relating to both realised artefacts. Candidates should not be expected to complete this sheet in full before moving on in the workbook. They should begin work on it from the outset of phase 2, but they will continue to both refer to it and add to it as their ideas develop, because the development of their work is likely to lead to new influences emerging. This sheet is followed by 2 development sheets for each artefact. Development sheet 1 involves exploring, considering and reconsidering the ideas candidates have produced in their classroom-based assessment 2 in new and different ways as their work progresses. They must regularly review the work they have done in order to identify its successes and failures to help them decide what to do next. They should make note of their decisions. Work in the development sheets must demonstrate observational, analytical drawing in a range of media. In order to facilitate working from primary sources, candidates may, if necessary, make studies or photographs outside of the classroom, and they can include these in their workbook. Development Sheet 2 follows on from Development Sheet 1 and should show how ideas progress using chosen materials, media, and techniques. It is essential that candidates spend sufficient time developing and refining their ideas and techniques in order for them to be able to produce their best possible artwork. The development sheets are used to record the steps they take to develop ideas, and it should also indicate their proposal for the realised artefact. The proposal involves identifying what they are going to make and choosing appropriate materials and techniques to carry out their plan to the highest possible standard. As I said before, candidates may make studies or photographs outside of the classroom, and they can include them in their workbook. You must be able to authenticate them as the student's own work. The workbook can also include samples of trial work that candidates have made in the art room during the course of the project, and this could include maybe embroidery stitches on fabric, colour combinations, texture trials, experiments on various grounds, students' own photographs, screenshots, printouts of students' own original material, and written notes. It is important to note the samples they attach should be small enough to allow students ample space to work directly into their workbook. When students have developed a proposal for the realised artefacts, they should sketch them on development sheet 2 and proceed to make their finished artefacts. On this slide, there will be a couple of points on the realised artefacts. Candidates' realised artefacts must be based on the visual and written information assembled in their workbook. The scale of student work should be appropriate to the time available and to the techniques, materials and media that are being used. Two-dimensional realised artefacts should be at least A5 and no bigger than A2. Three-dimensional realised artefacts should not exceed 1 metre in their greatest dimension. And the duration of a work of film or animation should not be less than 1 minute and not greater than 3 minutes. Candidates may submit a realised design proposal in 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, or both, in addition to the workbook as their artefact for design. After students have made their realised artefacts, they will reflect on and evaluate their work. Students will record these thoughts at the back of their workbook. This isn't a formal test of the writing, it's just a way for them to justify, critique and evaluate their own work. I'm just going to take a few moments to examine a new area of digital artefacts. All digital artefacts must be generated under the art teacher's supervision, and this is using the equipment and materials available within the school. Digitally generated artefacts, other than videos or something similar, must be printed out for submission for marking. For example, the area of practice of graphic design might lead to artefacts such as posters or magazine covers that have been created by digital means. These must be printed out for marking. If your students have produced digitally generated artefacts that are not suitable for printing, because maybe they involve moving images, these must be converted to MP4 video and available for viewing on a school computer, or other device with a screen of sufficient size and quality for it to be properly assessed. After the project completion date, it is important to store digital artefacts in a secure manner. The arrangement must be such that neither the candidate nor any other unauthorised person can access the material. And you will also need to take responsibility to ensure that these artefacts are retrieved from the students and uploaded to the device on which they will be viewed by the examiner. Again, to remind you, all of this information and additional information is available in Circular S106/18, and you will find a link to this circular on our website in the Visual Arts section. And finally, I'm going to hand you back over to Ruth now to look at some of the most frequently asked questions coming in around the area of the final assessment.
Thanks very much, Gemma. And thanks again to everybody for sending in your questions. We will do our best to get through as many of them as we can. So we're going to begin with, can my students work on their project outside of scheduled class time? And this question is in reference to phase 2. Okay, so in the interest of fairness for all students, additional supervised time outside of normally timetabled class time should not be made available unless some exceptional circumstances applies that prevents the recommended amount of time from being made available during class time. Now, such exceptional circumstances might involve, for example, an illness that prevents a candidate from attending school for a significant part of the project period. An application for an extension of the completion date on medical grounds must be made directly to the State Examinations Commission, and each candidate will be dealt with there on a case-by-case basis, and that is a reference from the circular S106/18. And another question we have is, will the examiner be able to access digital media for examination purposes? So while, as Gemma was mentioning earlier there just a few moments ago, while you should not be present while the examiners are carrying out work in June, you or another person with sufficient expertise should really be available in the school in case of equipment failure or difficulty accessing a particular candidate's video file. And again, that's a reference from the circular S106/18. And there's a lot more information on the circular that will be of interest to you there. And another question we have is, are there specific learning outcomes identified that need to be addressed by students for their final assessment? So in short, all of the learning outcomes in junior cycle visual arts specification may be assessed in the final assessment. So it's really important that students and teachers would refer to the brief on an annual basis, and that's the SEC brief there. And another question we have, how is the work going to be examined? So as happens currently for the Junior Certificate Art, Craft and Design, an SEC examiner appointed by the State Examinations Commission will visit the school in June each year to mark the final assessment in situ. Another question then, when will the marking scheme for the final assessment be available? Okay, so there are 200 marks allocated for the project, and they're broken down as follows. The workbook carrying 100 marks, the realised artefact 1 carrying 50 marks, and realised artefact 2 carrying 50 marks. And students' work will be marked according to how well they have demonstrated their ability to engage with the SEC brief and the elements of visual art. And now a further breakdown of the marking scheme will be available in the school year 2020-21. And another question we have here, what will the SEC accept as the realised artefact in the design strand? And is a design proposal acceptable, or will the SEC look for a fully finished realised artefact, for example, a poster, teapot or piece of jewellery? Okay, so in the final assessment, when students are designing for the making of either 2 dimensions or 3-dimensional artefacts, they should demonstrate and justify the relevant knowledge, skills, processes and materials associated with their chosen area of practice or discipline. Now, this may be in the form of a realised design proposal. And a realised design proposal is an artefact which contains all the information and the instructions necessary to make the proposed design. And the realised design proposal may be in 2 dimensions and, if appropriate, may be augmented by an artefact in 3 dimensions. And staying with the area of design, if a student submits their final realised design as a maquette or prototype in 3 dimensions, will the SEC accept it as the student's 3-dimensional component? So we might begin here, I suppose, by reminding ourselves of the definition of design in our visual arts specification. And it states, design is the process of planning, problem solving and creating. It can be a response to a brief, a need or a situation, emphasising the process of planning, problem solving and completion. And that's taken directly from page 10 of the specification. And as I've said in the previous question, a realised design proposal is an artefact which contains all the information and instructions necessary to make the proposed design. And when students are designing for their chosen area of practice or discipline, they should fully consider the relevant knowledge, skills, processes and materials associated with making for that area of practice or discipline. So for example, if a student is designing a three-dimensional ceramic pot, questions we could ask ourselves are, can the student demonstrate in 2 dimensions the relevant knowledge, skills, processes and materials required to make the ceramic pot in 3 dimensions? Or would a maquette or a prototype support their realised design proposal here? If a student wishes to submit a 3-dimensional artefact in the design strand for the final assessment, they must demonstrate the skills and knowledge associated with the generation of a 3-dimensional artefact in order to have access the full range of marks available. Now, unfortunately, that's the last question that we have time for this evening. I would like to say a sincere thank you for everybody who has sent in questions. There has been a huge volume of questions, and we may not have been able to get to your question, but be assured that we will get back to you and reply to them all, and we'll get back to you over the coming days. And with that, I'll pass you back to Gemma.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And just to reiterate there what Ruth is saying, we are aware there are lots of questions coming in tonight. So we will be answering questions sent to us this evening over the next few days as well. And I'll say this at the end of the presentation also, but if you have not received a response by Friday, you might email us at info@jct.ie and we will endeavour to get back to you early next week as soon as possible. Another point to note, there is a lot of information in this evening's webinar, and a recording of this webinar, which you can watch in your own time and you can pause it at different intervals, will be uploaded to our website as soon as possible, hopefully in the next few days. So we're coming near the end now, so just a few more points to go through. So on your screen now, you will see a summary of year 3, and I'm just going to give you a moment to scan down through it, and hopefully this will help. And again, this is a reminder of the key dates of the project, which is to be carried out in 2 phases during the year. And again, it is starting on or after Monday the 9th of September 2019. The first phase, which is classroom-based assessment 2, will be completed by Friday the 29th of November 2019. The work for this phase is not assessed by the State Examinations Commission. The second phase, the final assessment, starts after this and should be completed by mid-May 2020. The project brief, which governs both phases and incorporates the instructions to candidates, will be issued on Monday the 9th of September 2019 and will also be on the State Examinations Commission website on the same day. We get a lot of questions in about how schools might report on ongoing assessments. The 3 boxes indicate some of the terminology that can be used in reporting progress and achievement to parents and students as part of the school's reporting procedures and through the junior cycle profile of achievement. It is useful to note the language used for classroom-based assessments, which is the descriptors on your screen now, are only used for classroom-based assessments. If a school decides to include the results of in-house examinations in a student's report, then these results should be expressed in the terminology used by the State Examinations Commission for the terminal examination. In the report, it is important that the language used to describe performance in school examinations is kept separate from the language used to describe ongoing classroom assessments. And again, the information is on your screen now for the state examination and other summative assessments. Schools might find the ongoing reporting guidelines published by the NCCA useful in this regard. If you haven't already, please follow us on Twitter for any news and information and updates. And also I would ask if you would join our mailing list by going on to jct.ie, and there we can email you about upcoming webinars and any news and updates that come up. So we will again be answering questions sent in to us this evening over the next few days. And again, if you don't receive an email by Friday regarding your query, please email info@jct.ie. And finally, on behalf of the Visual Art team, I would like to sincerely thank you all for attending our webinar this evening. We hope you found it to be informative, and we would welcome any feedback that you may have. As ever, please contact us directly with any questions you may have, either through info@jct.ie or directly to our own emails, which you will find on the JCT website under the section Meet the Team. And finally, we would like to wish you and your students the very best of luck this year, and we really look forward to seeing you all again in our cluster workshops beginning in November up until Easter. Have a lovely evening.